But it is your inner consciousness that obeys this accelerating impulse. Once you start doing yoga, your inner consciousness begins to speed up its growth, its evolution. For the higher parts of your being readily follow the swift and concentrated movement of yoga and lend themselves more easily to the continuous adjustment and adaptation that it necessitates. See, we have to be able to grow constantly, a constant adjustment has to be made, and the ability not to rest anywhere but keep constantly growing. This is comparatively easy for the inner parts of our being. The body, on the other hand, is ordinarily dense, inept, and apathetic, incapable of moving as quickly as the rest of the beings. So what happens is a certain disharmony between your inner growth, the pace of the inner growth, and the pace needed for the body to support this inner growth. And so the body lags behind, the body can't keep up, and then this disharmony that is created between the inner being and the body results in illnesses. That's what she says. This divergence produces a disharmony in the nature and a dislocation in the system, and this can translate into illness. That is why here there is so much importance given to physical education, harmony of the body. You see, people were asking, why should Sri Aurobindo ashram have all these nice swimming pool and all this, gymnasium? Ashrams are for people who give up all these things. Swimming pool, it's only you found in five-star hotels. This is not a five-star, this is an ashram. And the mother used to insist, if you have to have a swimming pool, it must be the best of its kind. There is no compromise on that. People didn't understand this. See, by and large, body for us is a garbage bin. It must be, if you can't afford it, throw it, everything in that garbage bin. So body has to be ignored, neglected. How can a yogi have a nice body? It took mother 20-25 years to break down this hostility to the body right here in Pondicherry. Two things very visible to me of mother's presence here. I don't think in any part of the world flowers are valued as much as they are in Pondicherry. There is a kind of flower culture that the mother has made quite common here. Many people come. I'm not simply saying more flowers are grown here and sold here, but people are conscious. The second thing, of course, the scandalous thing when it began, that girls also ride bicycles. Horrified. People are horrified. Girls riding bicycles. Now the whole of Tamil Nadu, you have girls on bicycles. Things of this kind. Similarly, an attitude to the body. Body is the last. It's something, you're kind of ashamed of your body. The whole creation is manifestation. The whole purpose of this is to give a body to God. Ultimately, the perfection of yoga is to prepare a body fit for God. And here we are, making the basis of our yoga a dislike for the body, distaste for the body, neglect of the body. And that is why what the mother is saying is this kind of thing can happen. And therefore in our yoga, right from the early days, body gets all that attention it does get. 2 hours, 3 hours, a student of mine, I met subsequently, used to be here in Pondicherry, and he came to Hyderabad, and I asked him, what is it you miss most about leaving Pondicherry? He says, afternoon physical exercises. You see, every day we used to spend about 2.5 to 3 hours. So night time after supper, a little while later, we didn't have to invite sleep. We were blissfully asleep. The body was feeling so relaxed, body was feeling so fulfilled. Now there is no fulfillment for the body. See, the body has to has a consciousness, it has to be cultivated, it has to be taken along. It may be dull by its nature, but it can be quickened. And if the process is not functioning, if the process is not started, then there can be a dislocation between the speed with which the inner being grows and the outer being grows, and therefore an imbalance, and therefore illness, and therefore when the body is convinced it can't support you anymore in your future growth, it says goodbye. That's what it is. So he says, this divergence produces a disharmony in the nature and a dislocation in the system, and this can translate into illness. That is why people who take up yoga frequently fall ill. That need not happen if they are on their guard. That need not happen if they are on their guard. By yoga, the inner transformation that is in slow, constant process is rendered more intense and rapid, but the pace of the outer transformation remains almost the same as in ordinary life. What is the remedy? The mother says, if the whole being could simultaneously advance in its progressive transformation, there would be no illness, there would be no death. If the whole being progressed in harmony, not just the inner being, but the outer being also matched the progress of the inner being, then there is no question of any disharmony being created between the outer being and the inner being. But it will have to be the whole being, from the highest planes down to the most material, which is by nature rigid, stationary, refractory to any remolding change. The subtler the states are, the nearer the rhythm of advance approaches that of the divine growth. The subtler you are, the subtler the part of your being, the closer it is in its growth to the divine. But the material world is rigid by nature. Their transformation is slow, very slow, almost imperceptible for the measure of time as human consciousness perceives it. So that there is a constant lack of balance between the outer and the inner movement. It is this lack of balance, this incapacity of the outer form to follow the movement of progress that has made the disintegration and change of form necessary. So change of form is called death. And since our memory has built all these associations with an earlier form, it is reluctant to give it up. But this necessity, Mother continues, is not an abiding one. This is now seems to be a necessity. The body has fallen behind for whatever reason. The body is not able to match the speed of the inner being. But this necessity is not an abiding one, nor is its nature intrinsic and irrevocable. It is not intrinsic, it is an extraneous thing. Later on you will see some biological evidence which even supports this. In fact, it is wholly fortuitous. Death is wholly fortuitous, wholly accidental. It is not inherent. It is not a necessity and can thus be very well remedied. I don't know where and how she got these ideas and how she boldly announced it. And more people, more and more scientific evidence is suggesting this. Why should we should be able to infuse into this matter sufficient consciousness so that its rhythm of growth falls in line with that of the subtler parts of the being, and it becomes plastic enough to follow the inner progress. In that eventuality, the rupture of the equilibrium would not occur, and death would no longer be a necessity. And this is so because, as Sri Aurobindo has so emphatically asserted, death has no separate existence by itself. Death has no separate existence. We call certain kind of decay as death. There is nothing separately as death. A decay of a certain order we call death. It is only a result of the principle of decay in the body, and that principle is there already. It's part of the physical nature. At the same time, it is not inevitable. It's not just the mother who has said that. This is also from Sri Aurobindo, one of his letters. If one could have the necessary consciousness and force, decay and death is not inevitable. Death is at present the ineluctable end of life, unchanging end of life. That's what Sri Aurobindo says. At the moment, it is an ineluctable end of life. But this does not mean it can never be otherwise. Just because right now it seems to be an unchanging end to all life, it does not necessarily mean it has to be so for all time to come. That it is the unalterable law of existence. Death is a fact at present. Death is a fact at present for certain reasons. If these reasons are changed, death is not inevitable any longer. If these reasons are changed, it's not something you and I can go by just going out. A new yoga had to be developed. Mother had to give her body to this. All these things are there, but the possibility, first of all, humanity has to understand what is this that it's running away from. And once you understand it in the right way, in the right spirit, then it doesn't really matter what happens to you and me, but it's a question of the evolution, the evolutionary journey. We have to play our part in it. And our part in it is to deny that death is a necessary end of life. Even when about to die, we'll say death is not necessary part of life. If you do this, if this will is strengthened, and we understand why death comes, what are the reasons, and we take measures to eradicate these reasons. You see, God comes in our mind, we allow Him to come to our emotions, but here He stops. Here we say, you can't go below this, this is your area. And therefore the body has not received the God's touch. Body has not received God's illumination. It's not body's fault. We had denied it, God's presence, God's force, and you complain there is death. Just as the mind participates in this, emotions participate in this, the body is also anxious to participate in this. And for the first time, this has been very clearly articulated by Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Sri Aurobindo and the mother encourage disciples to translate this into their lives. Now, the mother herself said, encouraged her disciples that the supramental has descended. You have more help. You have more help, making your bodies more sensitive, making your body consciousness more plastic. But the more educated you are, unless you are an exception, the higher your degree of education, the higher your intellectual prowess, the lower your body consciousness. And therefore, There is a general assumption, if you are very frail and weak and namby-pamby, you must be an intellectual. Oh, he is an intellectual. All these are all superstitions, and we must shed these superstitions, give the body its place. Sharira madhyam khalu dharma sadhanam, we say right from class 1, but never give Sharira madhyam, the primacy of place to Sharira. Or our vital desires, the body has to bear. Our greed, our gluttony, our laziness, our inertia, our tamas, body has to suffer. It's like the donkey. You load things on it, and the donkey one day breaks its back and collapses. The body has suffered a great deal. The physical consciousness is anxious and eager to participate in this process of transformation. The greatest thing about this, the descent of the supramental, which we are celebrating on the 29th of February, it is not just another ritualistic day when you go up to the mother's room and come back and feel good about it. It's a great day. A great thing has happened on that day, just as a great thing happened on 24th of November 1926. Because of that, because of the descent of the overmental into the physical, man is now capable of going beyond the overmind. Otherwise, until now, it was not possible. That was the limit. And that had to be supported by something within ourselves. Now, the second great event after November 24, 1926 is this 29 February 1956. And this is not a small event. To make this event possible, Sri Aurobindo gave up his body. It's very paradoxical that to make it possible, to make it arrive earlier rather than later, he gave up his body in 1950, and within 6 years it descended on earth. So she says, the greatest thing that can ever be, the most marvelous thing since the beginning of creation. Can you understand what it means? Most marvelous thing since the beginning of creation. The miracle has happened. The mother to say the miracle has happened. And that's the only thing that concerns us most intimately. Forget about all the corruption and gundagardi, etc., etc. We only worried about those things. Remember this, that the great things promised have happened. What Sri Aurobindo, the mother, wanted to bring down have happened. And that's the only thing that concerns us most intimately, and the only thing that we should be concerned with. A new world, yes, a completely new world is born here and is here. That's what the mother said about the descent of the supramental, the 29th of February, and we are this time celebrating the anniversary of that. Now, there is, I am not a biologist, I am not a scientist, I am not anything, so I have an advantage of a dilettante. I can dip into this and dip into that. I don't have to be very precise and very correct and very exact and so on. So this is the advantage. I have collected some evidence, biological evidence, primarily from Jugal Das' book, Jugal Kishore Mukherjee. He has a book. From that book, I have collected this little evidence, which is very impressive. I will just read out to you biological evidence to suggest that death evolved at a later stage in the evolutionary journey of life. And death, immortality, is natural to the cells of the body and not death. But certain circumstances made death come, and if we can avoid those circumstances, overcome those circumstances, then death may not be necessary. And so I will read out primarily from his evidence that he has collected. There is a mass of scientific evidence which suggests that natural death is not to be regarded as an intrinsic necessity. As a matter of fact, and Jugalda quotes from Encyclopedia Britannica, etc., which is sufficiently standard to convince all professors of Indian universities that it is genuinely scientific material. He generally quotes from these sources, and he says, one of the quotations, neither senescence, that is getting old, etc., nor natural death is a necessary, inevitable consequence or attribute of life. Getting old and losing your vitality, aging, and death. He says, this is a quotation from somebody who wrote an article in Encyclopedia Britannica, and the title of that article is Biological Aspects of Death, in which he says, natural death is biologically a relatively new thing. You get it? Natural death is biologically a relatively new thing, which made its appearance only after the living organism had advanced a long way on the path of evolution. So death didn't come with life. Life came first. Death came much later. We can resolutely affirm, he has quoted from Russian writers as well as from American and British, this is from a Russian writer, we can resolutely affirm that in the actual terrestrial conditions of life, the immortality of the cell is an indubitable fact. This is a biologist talking about. The cells of the body are immortal. That's what he says. We can resolutely affirm that in the actual terrestrial conditions of life, the immortality of the cell is an indubitable fact. And what characterizes most a living organism, please listen to this. This is not me, this is not Jugalda, this is what he has quoted from a respectable scientist, and this is what the scientist says. And what characterizes most a living organism is its potential immortality and not its death. What characterizes most a living organism is its potential immortality and not its death. In fact, this is where I think we should stop, but there is still time. Dining room is not very far, so I think we should go ahead. I will finish the biological evidence for today and then we can take up something else tomorrow. The evidence collected by biology, Jugalda says in his book, is too massive for us to deal with here. In brief, it is as follows. All living organisms, plant or animal, are built up of cells. Everything is made up of cells. Of a single cell, which is called protozoan, or a group of cells, which is called metazoan. Protozoan, metazoan. If you hear protozoan, it means made of one cell. If it is metazoan, it means a cluster of cells. The doctrine of the immortality of protozoa, that is single cells, the doctrine of the immortality of the protozoa was already well established by German and Russian biologists by the end of the second decade of the 20th century. This is after what Sri Aurobindo has written about these things. Biology came to that conclusion the end of the second decade of the 20th century. This does not mean that these protozoa possess a charmed life exempt from all destruction and death. They are in fact being killed by vicissitudes of all kinds, such as accidents, lack of sufficient nutrition, variability of atmospheric conditions, and above all by their natural enemies. But at the same time, this too is a biological truth that some of these unicellular organisms are totally exempt from natural death. Unicellular organisms are totally exempt from natural death and possess to a fantastic degree the creative energy of self-multiplication. If you have any head for numbers, figures, I don't, I'll just read out. So much so that Woodruff, XYZ, I don't know who this Woodruff is, has calculated that a single cell would give in 7 years 4,473 generations, comprising 2 raised to the power of 3,340 cells, which, in all the eventuality of all of them remaining alive, would have a total protoplasmic mass whose volume would exceed that of our planet more than 10,000 times. One single cell. Aren't we glad cells are dying? If one single cell could multiply itself and become 10 times the mass of this earth, where will you and I be? What then, this is about unicellular, what then about sexually differentiated multicellular organisms? Here we encounter 2 types of cells. Germ cells, which carry the continuity of the line of the species, these, and what are called somatic cells, which constitute the body and tissues. There are 2 kinds of cells we all have. The germ cells and the somatic cells. We all have germ cells, which we pass on from one generation to the next, etc. And there, surprise of surprises, the germ cells are indeed equally immortal. The germ cells are equally immortal. The somatic cells degenerate and perish after some time, bringing about as a sequel the somatic death of the individual organism. Indeed, with the establishment of a body as distinct from the germ, natural death has entered the scene. Since, because of this, there is an epigram among biologists. And what is that epigram? Death is the price paid for a body. The cells, individual cells have no death, but if you want the cells to constitute a body and function as a body, then somewhere along the line death comes. So say death is the price paid for a body. But why this strange disability on the part of the somatic cells? It is not true that in some mysterious way a process of degeneration and the loss of the power of self-vision have come to inhere in the somatic cells, thus forcing them to lose their potential immortality. Even in multicellular organisms, the history is like this. Some of it lowly organized groups of metazoa, some of the low forms. See, we all think we are human and we are gods, but we are also a collection, biologically, we are all a collection of these cells. And there are various levels in the evolutionary journey. A sponge, what you call a sponge, is also a collection of cells. And there he says, some of the lowly organized groups of metazoa such as sponges, flatworms, polyps, hydras, jellyfish, etc., have retained the power of autophagy, leading to the production of new individuals, and thus manages to escape natural death. Their reproduction is by autophagy, that is, one thing splits into two parts, and each part grows into a whole. Sometimes it is horizontal, sometimes it is vertical, and sometimes one being divides itself into four parts, like crudely imagining one arm here, one leg here, trunk here. Then this arm slowly grows the rest of the body. So there is no death at this level. There is no corpse at this level. There is no dead body at this level. So at that level, even in the case of what are called metazoan life, multicellular life, there is no death. Death seems to have come later in the evolutionary journey. That's what it means. This shows that the metazoan concerned there is no death, since in passing from one generation to the next, there is no corpse or residue left. And two, for lowly organized metazoa, even for somatic cells, there is no death. A comparative study of the different species makes it abundantly clear that for somatic cells, natural death has not intervened all on a sudden in the history of biological evolution. As a matter of fact, death too has passed through a process of evolutionary elaboration. With the gradual loss of the aptitude for self-multiplication and restorative reconstruction, the body cells have become progressively mortal along the scale of organic evolution. Indeed, the consensus of opinion held by the biologists is that all the essential tissue elements of the metazoan body, such as nerve cells, muscle cells, heart muscle cells, spleen cells, connective tissue cells, kidney cells, and others are potentially immortal and can be made to grow indefinitely when placed and cultured outside the body of the organism in some nutrient medium. This is not good news for doctors eventually. But this is it. But it's a long, long time to come, so how then, a little more and then I conclude, how then does the multicellular body fall a prey to natural somatic death, although the constituent cells are potentially immortal? Professor Raymond Pearl answers this question as follows. It is the differentiation and specialization of function of the mutually dependent aggregates of cells and tissues which constitute the metazoan body that brings about death. In other words, there is mutual dependence on one cluster of cells, another cluster of cells. For blood to be what it is, the heart has to contribute, the kidney has to contribute, the other part has to contribute, and in this relationship, something can go wrong. But if you can manage this very well, if the body can be managed very well, and all this can be controlled very well, then death to that extent becomes a stranger. So death has come not because of the nature of the cells, but in the functioning of the body. The cells have to be mutually dependent for their function. And it is this relationship of dependency that can go wrong somewhere, and that is how death has come. That's what he says. That brings about death, and not in any inherent and inevitable mortal process in the individual cells themselves. When cells show characteristic senescent changes, it is perhaps because they are reflecting in their morphology and physiology a consequence of their mutually dependent association in the body as a whole, and not any necessary regressive process inherent in themselves. In other words, in the light of present knowledge, we can assert that individual cells never grow old. They are potentially young and potentially immortal. And natural death suffered by somatic cells is by no means an intrinsic necessity, but rather a fortuitous circumstance. As a matter of fact, this is from Raymond Pearl, as a matter of fact, what most characterizes a living organism is its immortality and not its death. Sri Aurobindo and the mother never claimed to be great scientists. They said, we are looking at this spiritual light. This is all biology, the most modern of sciences, and this seems to be their conclusion. So some happy thoughts while having lunch, I suppose. We have been celebrating the 12th anniversary of what the mother called the Golden Day, 29 February 1956. Each leap year, we observe the anniversary of that day. Now, friends have suggested I should say a few words very briefly about this Golden Day. What is it we are celebrating, and why are we celebrating it? Now, a great deal has been written about it, and there is a great deal of speculation about it. So I don't want to go on and on, but try to say in mother's own words the essential things that we need to know about this Golden Day. Now, it so happens that I was asked only yesterday by somebody to give a brief write-up to be sent to a center overseas on this day, on this particular event. So I have prepared that write-up, so before it goes overseas, it can be locally used. So I will read that and then raise one or two questions about this. Many people have asked questions like, if the supramental has descended, why don't we see it? And again, why is it there is more corruption, this, that, and the other? So I don't want to go into all these because some of these are left. Some of these questions cannot be answered to the full satisfaction of one's reason. That's God's way. And therefore, whatever can be said about it safely, I will say that once again, not in my words, but in the words of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Has it started operating? And the second question is, how long will it take? Is this only a promise that will be realized sometime in future? Or are we going to see a bit of that action ourselves in our own lives? These are some of the questions people keep asking. So I will read out from Sri Aurobindo's writings and the mother's writings, whatever they have said about it. And what is it that they expect us to do if we want to participate and benefit from the descent of the supramental? That also the program Sri Aurobindo has given. So we'll just touch upon these 2-3 points after reading out this little handout I have prepared to be sent to this overseas center. The supramental manifestation, February the 29th, 1956. On February 29, 1956, the greatest event in the history of this world of ours took place. There is, if you really look at the significance, there is no doubt that this is not an exaggeration. This is a statement of fact. The greatest event in the history of this world of ours took place. The gates of the supramental were thrown open, and the supramental consciousness, light and force began to flood the earth, and the mother called this day the golden day. In the evening of that day, the mother was at the ashram playground, and most of the ashram inmates had also assembled there for meditation. And the descent of the supramental consciousness upon earth happened during that meditation. The mother wrote about this event soon after and informed the ashram inmates and her devotees and disciples the world over about it. She wrote, and I quote, "This evening, the divine presence, concrete and material, was there present amongst you. I had a form of living gold bigger than the universe, and I was facing a huge and massive golden door which separated the world from the divine. As I looked at the door, I knew and willed in a single movement of consciousness that the time has come, and lifting with both hands a mighty golden hammer, I struck one blow, one single blow on the door, and the door was shattered to pieces. Then the supramental light and force and consciousness rushed down upon earth in an uninterrupted flow." Quotation marks complete. The significance of this great event is that the great aim was accomplished for which Sri Aurobindo and the mother had labored for decades, and for which Sri Aurobindo had even sacrificed his body 6 years earlier. A new world, a completely new world was born on that day and has been here on earth ever since. A new evolution, the evolution of a divine species, could now begin and has in fact begun. Conditions are more propitious than ever before for the human body to grow in suppleness and plasticity so that it can keep pace with the soul in its progress, and thus gradually rid itself of the process which is now responsible for its decay and death. This will enable the human body to undergo a complete transformation and thus to abrogate the law of death. Our earthly life will then flower into the immortal life divine. In a message given on the 29th of March 1956, 1 month later, the mother announced, "Lord, thou hast willed, and I execute. A new light breaks upon the earth, a new world is born, the things that were promised are fulfilled. Now, as I said, I would like to say just a little more about this, mainly in answer to two questions. What exactly is happening now? In 1967, the mother announced that the supramental force had started operating at the physical level. This is in 1967, about 34 years ago. Now, this question is often raised: when do we see tangible results? The new age has begun, and the new revolution that Sri Aurobindo and the mother have been talking about has already started. Well, there are a few things which the mother herself has said about it, so I will read out. The mother once said, between the descent of the mind and the actual arrival of the human being here on earth, it must have taken about 1,000,000 years. That's a long, long time. But somewhere along in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo says about this speed, he says, the first obscure material movement of the evolutionary force is marked by an aeonic graduality. That is, from the material level to the life level, to the level of the vital, it must have taken several billion years. So he says that force works with a aeonic graduality. The movement of life progress proceeds slowly, but still with a quicker step. It is concentrated into the figure of millenniums. When the vital level it starts working, you will see results in millenniums. Mind can still further compress the tardy leisureliness of time and make long paces of the centuries. So when it comes to the mental level, from millenniums we come to centuries. But when the conscious spirit intervenes, a supremely concentrated pace of evolutionary pace becomes possible. What she says is, when the spirit directly begins to intervene, it will not take as it has taken in the past. In fact, those who have studied the history of evolution have pointed out that there has been a tremendous acceleration from matter to life to mind, and from mind now it's going to be very, very fast. But still, how fast? Well, the mother once said, they used to say, it would take a few thousand years. I don't think anybody is here then would feel that it's something that you and I will participate in. But then, that was long before the mother began the yoga of the body. And in her 80s and 90s, the mother, you can see from records, agenda, etc., virtually went through hell. It's a tremendous yoga which nature left to itself would have taken several thousand years. What it primarily meant was to change the structure of the cells of the human body such that they become able to carry the new force. Left to itself, nature does it, but nature's way is it take, as she said, several thousand years. But the mother had come precisely for this work, so she offered her body. It became the living laboratory And she did this work for several years, and it looks now that she took away the work of several, at least 3,000-4,000 years already. A small part is left, and that part I will read out. It is left for the appearance of the supramental race, for the supramental individuals to appear. I don't think there is any more time left. The mother has said, subsequently Nalnida also has confirmed this, that the process has already begun. The only thing is, these things do not go around publishing in newspaper headlines. These victories are not announced by great fanfare. This is a quiet growth. This growth has already started, is already begun. I don't want to give instances and say, look, because this has happened, the Iron Curtain disintegrated, this happened, that happened. I don't want to say any of these things. It is for each one of us to feel within ourselves. So the answer to the question, how long it will take, is that it will take as long as you do not wake up. If you wake up, it's now. If you do not wake up, it will take endless years. There is a statement to this effect by the mother. I hope for your sake and my sake, I'll find it. Okay. This is the statement Sri Aurobindo made in the Life Divine a long time ago. The first, I just read it to you, and mother says, I am reading this to you because I have been asked about the action of the supermind, and I had compared this manifestation of the supermind to that of the mind, which according to all modern scientific discoveries took nearly 1 million years to evolve from the animal brain, the ape brain, to the first human brain. It took 1 million years. And I told you that consequently one should not expect this to take place in a few months or a few years, and that it would obviously take much longer. Some people, it seems, thought that I was announcing that the Superman would not come before another 1 million years. Some people thought, ours is a gone case, another 1 million years, we won't see the Superman. I want to correct this impression. Sri Aurobindo has said that as the development rises in the scale of consciousness, the movement becomes more and more rapid, and that when the spirit or the supermind intervenes, it can go much faster. Therefore, we may hope that in a few centuries, the first supramental race will appear. This, as I told you, was said by the mother in 1956. A couple of years before, she took up very seriously the yoga of the body. But even that is rather disconcerting for some people, for they think it contradicts what Sri Aurobindo has always promised, that the time has come for the supramental transformation to be possible. But we must not confuse a supramental transformation with the appearing of a new race. What Sri Aurobindo promised and what naturally interests us, we who are here now, is that the time has come when some beings among the elite of humanity, elite of humanity doesn't mean a degree from Harvard or Stanford. This eliteness is determined by the level of your consciousness. That is the qualifying thing. The elite of humanity who fulfill the conditions necessary for spiritualization will be able to transform their bodies with the help of the supramental force, consciousness and light, so as no longer to be animal men, but become supermen. The time has come, she says, it is possible now. This promise Sri Aurobindo has made, and he based it on the knowledge that he had that the supramental force was on the point of manifesting on the earth. In fact, it had descended in him long ago. He knew it and knew what its effects were. And now that it has manifested universally, I could say, generally, the certainty of the possibility of transformation is, of course, still greater. There is no longer any doubt that those who will fulfill or who now fulfill the conditions are on the way to this transformation. This transformation can only come if the conditions for this transformation are fulfilled. The conditions of this transformation, Sri Aurobindo has given in detail in the synthesis of yoga and in still greater detail in his last articles on the supramental manifestation. This is the last book he wrote, the supramental manifestation upon earth. Now, if someone wants to ask me a question on the subjects, etc., I will just read out what Sri Aurobindo said in the synthesis of yoga about the three conditions necessary before you can make an application to the supramental consciousness that you would like to be a candidate. What are these three conditions? This is on synthesis of yoga, and the mother probably read this at that time. It is then by a transformation of life in its very principle, not by an external manipulation of its phenomena, that the integral yoga proposes to change it from a troubled and ignorant into a luminous and harmonious movement of nature. There are three conditions which are indispensable for the achievement of this central inner revolution and a new formation. And these conditions are not very, very new. We all know them. The only problem is accepting these conditions and live our life accordingly. And what are these conditions? None of them is altogether sufficient in itself, but by their united threefold power, the uplifting can be done, the conversion made, and completely made. For first, life as it is a movement of desire, and it has built in us as its center a desire soul, which refers to itself all the motion of life and puts in them its own troubled hue and pain of an ignorant, half-lit, baffled endeavor. For a divine living, desire must be abolished and replaced by a purer and firmer motive power, the tormented soul of desire dissolved, and in its stead there must emerge the calm, strength, happiness of a true vital being now concealed within us. Next, life as it is driven or led partly by the impulse of the life force, partly by a mind which is mostly a servant and abettor of the ignorant life impulse, but in part also its uneasy and not too luminous or competent guide and mentor. For a divine life, the mind and the life impulse must cease to be anything but instruments, and the inmost psychic being must take their place as the leader on the path and the indicator of a divine guidance. Last, life as it is turned towards the satisfaction of the separative ego. Ego must disappear and be replaced by the true spiritual person, the central being. The life itself must be turned towards the fulfillment of the divine in terrestrial existence. It must feed a divine force, awaking within it, and become an obedient instrumentation of its purpose. I think I shouldn't go on and on. This should be enough to indicate to us that these are the conditions. If we fulfill these conditions, to the measure in which we fulfill these conditions, the help will be there, the response will be there, and it is for nothing that Sri Aurobindo and the mother came down to earth and joined and together and performed this tapasya here for several years, several decades. In the past, one avatar came at a time. This time, notice both had to descend at the same time because the work to be accomplished was particularly difficult. And they came and they did what had to be done. The gates have been thrown open. The conditions, the work that needs to be done has already been given to us. And as I said, the supramental race may take some time, but the supramental transformation can take place right away in individuals who are ready for it. On 24th November 1926, the descent of the overmental to the physical consciousness, and subsequently, after nearly 30 years, the descent of the supramental consciousness to the physical consciousness, the earth consciousness, have completed all the preparation that was needed for this breakthrough. The breakthrough has been achieved. Sri Aurobindo and the mother gave all the tapasya for this breakthrough, and that's the reason why 24th November 1926 is still celebrated in the ashram as the Siddhi day, and this was the perfect final Siddhi of Sri Aurobindo's yoga, and that's why the mother called this the Golden Day, 29th February 1956, and we are now celebrating the 12th anniversary of this Golden Day. I think before I say anything about this at all or go back to Savitri, we'll have a brief meditation for about 5 minutes. A couple of more points we need to develop in our study of the problem of death and immortality, which we started a couple of days ago, but probably we'll take it up when we come back on the first. There is this assertion that Sri Aurobindo has made that death really has no existence. Death is a process of life. Now this seems to be very paradoxical, but we need to look at it, try to understand what he means by it. But I don't think we'll have the time to do that today, because our primary concern is to look at Canto 1, Book 9, which we left yesterday at page 573. Now, before I continue, a friend of mine wants to know if there is anybody here in the audience who has come from Indore. Anybody here from Indore? No, he doesn't want you. Somebody is going to Indore, not just from Indore. Going back to Indore, he wants to send some books to the center there. Nobody from Indore? Page 573, we are at the beginning of the second section of that canto, Book 9, Canto 1. We have seen now that Satyavan is dead and Savitri has Satyavan lying down there on the ground with his head on her lap. and she is all alone. The god of death has already appeared on the scene, but Savitri doesn't immediately take any notice of his presence. But in the meanwhile, we have seen that a great transformation comes over Savitri. Savitri is, when we first begin this canto, she is just an ordinary helpless woman. But by the time we come to the end of the first section of this canto, she is no more just a weakling, just an ordinary woman entrusted with this stupendous task of confronting the god of death. Savitri's real person, as it were, and the power of that real person, Savitri, as you know, is the Supreme Mother herself, descends into her. And that's the description we read out last time from line 16. Then suddenly there came on her the change which in tremendous moments of our lives can overtake sometimes the human soul and hold it up towards its luminous source. From that point on until this, immortal leader of our mortality, page 573, line 80, immortal leader of our mortality, doer of our works and fountain of our words, invulnerable by time, omnipotent. It stood above her, calm, immobile, mute. This new power that has now taken possession of Savitri, as it were, or Savitri has realized within herself, is so strong that nothing in time can trouble it and touch it. So we now move on from that point to the next section, section 2, all in her mated with that mighty hour, as if the last remnant had been slain by death of the humanity that once was hers. Everything in Savitri responded to the presence of this new power that we just saw. All in her mated with that mighty hour and underwent this great change, as if, and in the process, the last remnant had been slain by death of the humanity that once was hers. The human being, with all its normal feelings, tendencies, weaknesses, etc., was no more left in Savitri. She was no more just a human being. She is now a new power. That transformation had assured that, because without that power, it is difficult to confront the god of death. Assuming a spiritual wide control, making life see a mirror of heaven's sky, the young divinity in her earthly limbs, filled with a celestial strength her mortal part. Assuming a spiritual wide control, the whole her being was now under control of this new spiritual control, and it filled her life energies with the spirit from above, making life see a mirror of heaven's sky. The new power was the heaven, and her being, as it were, was a mirror. It received the new power. Life energies now came down from the spirit. The young divinity in her earthly limbs, filled with celestial strength, her mortal part. Everything that was mortal now was filled by celestial strength. Over was the haunted pain, the rending fear. Her grief had passed away. Her mind was still. Her heart beat quietly with a sovereign force. Over was the haunted pain, the pain that haunted her. Not only after the death of Satyavan, but even before the death of Satyavan. The feeling that Satyavan was there only for a short while and he was going to disappear forever, etc. This pain was no more. Over was the haunted pain and the rending fear. As I read out to you the line from the mother, he who fears death has already been conquered by death. So there has to be no fear. There was no fear anymore in Savitri, so the fear is gone. The pain is gone. Her grief had passed away. Her mind was still. Her heart beat quietly with a sovereign force. It beat quietly, all right, but it beat with the awareness of a very great power behind it. There came a freedom from the heartstrings clutch. Now all her acts sprang from a Godhead's calm. Calmly she laid upon the forest soil the dead who still reposed upon her breast, and bore to turn away from the dead form. So now she rose to meet the dreadful God. All the time, Satyavan's head was still on her lap, and she had, clutched it very close to her heart. Now, that attachment to the body, that heartstrings clutch was no more. There came a freedom from the heartstrings clutch. Now all her acts sprang from a Godhead's calm. Everything that he did from now on, this action, every action of hers, as it were, came from a calm. The calm that now became her normal state because of the Godhead that had now possessed her, that she had become. Now all her acts sprang from a Godhead's calm. Calmly she laid upon the forest soil the dead who still reposed upon her breast. Slowly she moves Satyavan's head away from her and puts it on the ground. Calmly she is laid upon the forest soil, on the soil of the forest, the dead who still reposed upon her breast, and bore to turn away from the dead form. And bore had now the courage to turn her face away from this dead body. Soul now she rose to meet the dreadful God, alone and all by herself. Soul now she rose to meet the dreadful God. So she has now the confidence. She is now prepared to face this dread God, dreadful God, God of death, Yama. That mightier spirit turned its mastering gaze on life and things, inheritor of a work left to it unfinished from her halting past, when yet the mind a passionate learner toiled, and ill-shaped instruments were crudely moved. Sri Aurobindo doesn't want you to forget that this is not just one woman's private tragedy. The private tragedy of Savitri's life is a symbol of the tragedy that has haunted human life ever since life began here on earth. And Savitri had come here, she had a work to do, but this work could not have been done without the new power that now she has acquired. With the power of the mind, this work cannot be done. So it says, that mightier spirit turned its mastering gaze on life and things. The new spirit that had now come over Savitri looked upon life all around her calmly and quietly, and because she was the inheritor of a work left to it unfinished from her halting past. This Savitri had inherited an incomplete job. Incomplete job is the complete manifestation of the divine. The divine has been manifesting here. It's not as if this world is bereft of divine. But divine has conquered certain territories, certain regions, but not all. But the ultimate triumph over death is not, as I have been explaining to you, is not just a matter of being attached to a body. Body is not important. It's a symbol of the spirit's triumph over matter. The spirit's, God's triumph, as it were, over every detail of matter. This consciousness that has been gradually manifesting here, it has done already wonders. There are more wonders to achieve. And the final wonder would be when the body that is formed will be in a position to cast itself when it chooses and not when it is forced to. Now what has happened is, death doesn't ask us. Death comes and overtakes us, and we are kind of submerged in a phase of inconscient, we don't know where we go. We don't want this to happen. We want that we continue to grow consciously from one body into another body. That's the kind of mastery. Now, for that mastery to come, we have to conquer matter. Matter has to surrender itself completely for this transformation. So that is the job left unfinished. But this job could not have been finished until now because the power needed to do it wasn't there. And that is why all the saints we had, all the other people who came around and who wanted to help man, etc., concluded that this is a job that cannot be done because there was no power and nobody had discovered that power. With the power of the mind, with the power, other kinds of things that you have, life basically cannot be changed. And therefore, in their wisdom, it is not as if they were not, they just didn't realize. They did realize that it's a difficult thing, it's an impossible thing to transform life. And that's why they said, look, you have your innings. When you are fed up, ultimately you turn within, turn to the kingdom of God within you and grow there. And you find there permanent peace, permanent bliss. This world, this body that you have cannot be transformed because man still doesn't have the power and the capacity. It is Sri Aurobindo for the first time said, no, I will not accept this fact that God's work will be forever left incomplete. God must have a plan to bring perfection in all its details. And that's why the yoga, that's why all this sadhana. And so, Savitri is now the inheritor of this legacy, and she says, when yet the mind a passionate learner foiled, and ill-shaped instruments were crudely moved. Until now, the instruments were crude, the instruments were not good enough for the task that Savitri has now undertaken. Transcended now was the poor human rule. A sovereign power was there, a godlike will. Now Savitri represents a sovereign power and a godlike will. A moment yet, she lingered motionless. You see, Sri Aurobindo never forgets the human being in Savitri. The human is always there. So even now, with all this awareness of the great power and the great work that she had to do and the responsibility she owns up, a moment yet she lingered motionless and looked down on the dead man at her feet. She takes one last look at the body of Satyavan lying there on the ground. A moment yet she lingered motionless and looked down on the dead man at her feet. And how he describes it, then like a tree recovering from a wind, she raised her noble head, fronting her gaze. Something stood there, unearthly, somber, grand, a limitless denial of all beings that wore the terror and wonder of a shape. When he wants it, he can crowd the whole world into 4 lines. Otherwise, he can amble along leisurely for pages and pages. Now he says, just for a minute, Savitri looked at that body and he compares that to a tree caught up in a gale. When the tree is swaying here and there, and suddenly the tree has decided, no, I won't give in to this storm, and steadied itself. So that's what is described. Then like a tree recovering from a wind, she raised her noble head, fronting her gaze. She looked directly into the face of death, God of death. What does she see? Something stood there, unearthly, somber, grand, a limitless denial of all being. The word used in Vyasa is antaka, the one who denies everything. Antaka is one who ends everything. That's the appropriate Sanskrit word for it. And Sri Aurobindo transcribes it, translates it to English. A limitless denial of all being. Death really stands for this denial. There is this affirmation and denial. There is this what is called astikya. You see, all this is You build on this word, there is this creation has to flourish, this creation has to be taken to perfection. That's what it means to believe in God. To believe in that simply means, no, we don't want this. This can be here at the most for a short while. Ultimately, this is just an illusion. This is just a shadow play. We won't have nothing of this. That's the denial. And the God of death represents this denial. And therefore, it's called a limitless denial of all beings that wore the terror and wonder of a shape. What kind of a shape he had? The terror of a shape and the wonder of a shape. The terror and wonder of a shape. In its appalling eyes, now there is a description of the God of death. In its appalling eyes, the tenebrous form bore the deep pity of destroying gods. In its appalling eyes, the eyes were appalling, fierce. That dark form, the tenebrous form, bore the deep pity of destroying gods. This is not a pity of compassion. This is a pity of contempt, destroying gods. After all this world is meant for me. You see, I am the one who ultimately finishes off this world. The Vishwarupa in the Gita, when the Lord stands up and all the warriors just go into his mouth. That's the kind of picture, Antaka. That's the kind of thing that he has here. So he bore the deep pity. Of course it's pity, but of destroying gods. A sorrowful irony curved the dreadful lips. The dreadful lips of this being were marked by a sorrowful irony. There was irony in it. What is this? You take all this life so seriously. This life is really a joke. Why do you have to take it seriously? Kind of sorrowful irony curved the dreadful lips. The lips were curved, as you can see, but with all this they were very dreadful. That speak the word of doom, eternal night, in the dire beauty of an immortal face, pitying a rose, receiving all that lives forever into its fathomless heart. This being had a fathomless heart, and it was where everything went in. Bhishma went in, Drona went in, Duryodhana went in, all the 100 brothers went in, everybody went in. That is time the destroyer. That's also an aspect of this. It's a refuge of creatures from their anguish and world pain. The world is full of suffering and anguish and pain, and so the God of death promises, I will give you relief. I will give you relief in my stomach, where you will rest forever and ever in the inconscient. That is the memory, that is the picture that Sri Aurobindo is creating here. In its appalling eyes, the tenebrous form bore the deep pity of destroying gods. A sorrowful irony curved the dreadful lips that speak the word of doom. Eternal night in the dire beauty of an immortal face. He doesn't want us to think that the God of death is ugly or anything. There is a beauty. That beauty strikes terror. That's the kind of beauty you have. The dire beauty of an immortal face, pitying a rose, receiving all that lives forever into its fathomless heart, refuge of creatures from their anguish and world pain. His shape was nothingness made real. This is a stroke of genius. Nothingness made real. How do you make nothingness real? The God of death's shape is describing his shape. It was nothingness made real. He is the ultimate denier of everything. So the ultimate denier of everything has to have a shape appropriate to this denial. So he is made out of nothing, but nothingness made real. So it looks like a form, but it's basically made of nothingness. His shape was nothingness made real. His limbs were monument of transience. His limbs were monuments of transience. Because ultimately it's death which says everything in this world is transient, everything is passing. So he has also he has also made up of limbs which are transient, and beneath brows of unwearying calm. His eyebrows have unwearying calm, large, god-like lids. The eyelids were large, god-like lids, silent. What did the eyes look at? Silent beheld the writhing serpent life. The god of death looks at life. The life is like a writhing serpent. Anything that the god of death looks at, terrorized, and it becomes like a writhing serpent. That kind of a terror, the eyes, the look of this god of death contains. So he describes it. His shape was nothingness made real. Now, I've always wondered, if 5 artists were asked to paint after reading Savitri, give us a painting of Savitri. It's very strange that Sri Aurobindo has described Savitri in considerable detail. And also, it is a description, it looks as if it's the outside of Savitri is describing. But he is not. It is very difficult for us to say what Savitri was. Did she have long hair or short hair? How tall was she? What was her nose like? It's very difficult. Now, if you take this god of death and you want to paint this god of death, how will you paint him when the shape was nothingness made real? So there is plenty of scope for people's imagination. See, this is the art that is totally alien to modern poetry. What the modern poetry tries to do is, modern poetry tries to describe a reality, the external reality, in terms of internal associations. But Sri Aurobindo does exactly the opposite. His interest is not, he wants to describe anything outer. He wants to describe everything internal, inward. But his description is always in terms of the external reality. For example, when he describes the dawn is at the very beginning of Savitri, in the very first canto, first book. It is the dawn of a particular day. So he has to describe the physical details of that dawn. But he describes the physical details of the dawn in such a way that all the time you are reminded of inner dawns and not outer dawn. In fact, the whole thing is like this. The art of Savitri is like this. He is going to tell you the story of Savitri, but in trying to tell you the story, external story of Savitri, he is telling the inner symbolization of the story. The inner is what interests him. But his mode of expression looks as if he is talking in terms of the outer details. Exactly the same way. He is not describing to you the mindset of the god of Yama. He is not describing to you anything really that looks like subjectivity. All the time you look as if he is describing his arms, he is describing his face, he is describing his lips. Everything is external. But in trying to describe this, it is not the external he is interested in, he is interested in the internal. This is exactly the opposite, and that's why many people who have great taste and great learning and understanding of modern poetry find Sri Aurobindo extremely difficult, because his art is exactly in the opposite direction. It goes in the opposite direction. And here is a very good example. The god of death is being described, his outer details are being described in such a way that you get more the interior landscape rather than the external person. And that's why details like his shape was nothingness made real, his limbs were monuments of transience, and beneath brows of unwearying calm, large godlike lids, silent beheld the writhing serpent life. Unmoved, that timeless, wide, unchanging gaze had seen the unprofitable cycles pass. The god of death had seen unprofitable cycles, various yugas, Satya Yuga, then various yugas, Dwapara Yuga, Kali Yuga, once again Satya Yuga. The god of death is totally unconcerned. This is a useless thing. The cycles go on, and he is not at all bothered because he knows at any time he can put his foot down and bring the whole thing down. That's the god of death. Unmoved with that timeless, wide, unchanging gaze, had seen the unprofitable cycles pass, survived the passing of unnumbered stars. He has seen several suns disappear, disintegrate, several stars disintegrate, several universes disintegrate. The pralaya. One creation comes, goes into pralaya, another comes, another goes into pralaya. He has seen many of these. The mother somewhere says that this is the seventh creation. 6 times the creation has come, but couldn't go beyond a particular point. But this time he assured us, please don't panic. This time we are going to make it.